Welcome back. It was a crime which pushed everything else off the front pages. 3 men, all known criminals, found shot dead in the Essex countryside. It was a cold-blooded, professional killing. The victims had many enemies, but which one wanted them executed?
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. Later that night, Steele called me up and asked me if I wanted to go to Amsterdam with him. Apparently everyone else he had tried had said no. They all suspected that Harris had deliberately ripped us off, and that going back over there to try and get the money back was suicide. But Mick didn't seem worried, and that made me more confident. There was also the fact that although I'd already spent it, I hadn't earned any money from the last deal, because I'd had to give it all back. I was desperate for cash, and Mick promised to pay me for the trip. Also, Mick only planned to be in Amsterdam for a couple of hours. Just enough time to pick up the money and have a drink, he said. He'd done enough to convince me. OK Mick, count me in. I picked Mick up from Angers Green, and we drove to Harwich in my old Land Rover, freezing our bollocks off all the way because the Rover's got a window missing. We were travelling overnight, so I had a change of clothing with me, and then when we got to the ferry terminal, I booked the tickets in my name and got some guilders. We were trying to make a holiday of it, keep the mood light. We had a meal in the restaurant at the departure lounge, then got a cabin on the boat. We had a few drinks in the bar where they had some live singers, then went to the boat cinema and watched a film, then went to our cabin to get a few hours sleep before we arrived in Amsterdam. Early on Tuesday morning, DCI Story put his plan into action and raided Pat Tate's flat in Swanstead, where Tucker's mistress Donna Garwood was living. A small quantity of amphetamine was found, and Garwood spent a few hours in the cells before a fuming Tucker arrived to bail her out. There had been other raids across Basildon that morning too, most of them friends of Lear's or bagmen some way down the drug supply chain. But for Tucker, the message was clear. They were onto him. He had an emergency meeting with Tate and Rolfe about what they were going to do. Then the firm had its first lucky break. Steve Packham and Stephen Smith had been arrested and charged with supplying the tablets. The police had their result, and the public had their scapegoat. All the firm had to do now was wait for Steele to sort out their cannabis deal, and everything would be sweet as a nut once more. Darren Nichols states, "We met Dopey Harris in the bar. He said he was happy to give us the money back there and then, but he only had it in guilders. Harris wanted the drugs back. God knows why, as they're all crap. But Mick told him they were safe back in England, and as soon as we had the money, he'd set up a collection. It was just after 10 AM, so Mick said we'd go back in the afternoon to give him some time to get the money together. No one was going to want to have to change their money back over in England, especially as the banks have to report any transactions of more than £10,000. We spent the day sightseeing and went back to the bar around 5 PM. Harris took us upstairs and handed over £30,000 sterling. He apologised, but said basically there hadn't been many Brits making sales that day, so there wasn't a lot of sterling around. Again, he said we could have the rest in guilders, but Mick decided to stay overnight and see what he could raise the next day. For the rest of the afternoon, we were either sightseeing or having a giggle in the red light district, or in some bar drinking loads of beer, or in some restaurant stuffing our faces. I was having the time of my life. It was the closest thing I'd had to a holiday in years, and Mick and I were getting on really well. That night, we booked into the Delta Hotel, and I booked a twin room in my name. Mick didn't want anything to link him there, but gave me the money to pay for it. We put the cash that Harris had given us into the hotel safe and spent the rest of the night out on the piss. It was nearly lunchtime when we got round to Harris's the next day, but he said we still hadn't left it long enough. We'd have to come back. That afternoon, Mick and I went to Madame Tussauds and had our photograph taken with Tina Turner. Around 5 PM, we went back to the bar again, and Harris gave us another £50,000 in sterling. He said that he might have more tomorrow, so we decided to spend yet another night in the Delta. By now, the novelty was really starting to wear off. I'd enjoyed it at first, but I was still wearing the only set of clothes I had, and all the endless drinking and eating was starting to get really boring. We could never really relax properly because we were anxious to get going, but every plan we made to catch a particular train or something ended up being postponed. Most of the Brits who go to Amsterdam just spend their whole time off their faces on super skunk, but neither Mick nor I smoked the stuff, we just smuggled it. We went to Harris's yet again the next day, and he told us that he wouldn't have any sterling at all that day. At first, Mick decided to stay another night, so we booked the Delta again. But around 5 PM, Mick was getting so bored and restless with Amsterdam that we decided to accept the rest, about £40,000 in guilders. We went back to Harris's and told him, and he said we could have the rest of the money in 1 hour. In that time, Mick bought some phone cards, the batteries on both our mobiles were dead by now, and called up Jack Womes, Pat Tate and the others to tell them to come over and meet him in Ostend to pick up their money. Mick didn't want to risk being found with too much on him at one time, so the idea was for lots of people to come over and take a few £1,000 back each. Harris told Mick that with the way the exchange rate was, he had given us more than enough to cover the debt. He seemed very keen to make amends and never stopped apologising for having sold us the dodgy puff in the first place. Having hated the guy's guts a few days earlier, we ended up thinking as he waved us goodbye and wished us well, that perhaps he wasn't such a bad bloke after all. We had collected our bags from the hotel and were just making our way down to the train station when I thought I saw a familiar face. Now Amsterdam's a fairly small place, and if you hang out in the centre long enough, you do tend to see the same faces doing the casual circuit of bars and clubs. But this bloke didn't look like he was actually going anywhere. He looked like he was following us. I couldn't be sure. The bloke was quite far behind and he may or may not have been with a couple of other people, but I thought I might as well mention it to Mick. It turned out he had already spotted him and was equally concerned. Instead of heading straight for the station, we took a slightly longer, odder route. The bloke was still there, so we walked along the canal and popped into a bar for a quick drink. When we came out, the bloke was still there. The fact that we had spotted him meant the guy wasn't good enough to be a professional, so the most likely explanation was that Harris had decided to arrange a nasty little surprise mugging in an attempt to get his money back. With that in mind, neither of us liked the idea of being trapped on a speeding train if it all kicked off, so we decided to take drastic action. When we got to the station, we nipped over the road and jumped into a taxi. "Hi," said Mick, "can you take us to Ostend?" The driver's jaw nearly hit the floor. It was a bit like getting into a black cab outside Charing Cross and asking to be taken to Manchester. At first, the driver wanted 1,000 guilders, but we offered him 600. Eventually, we settled on 800, around £400, and we set off. We told him to take the scenic route out of the city, going round roundabouts several times, that sort of thing, until we were sure that no one was following us anymore. Back in England, the members of the London firm were preparing to go to Ostend to collect their money. Tony Tucker had decided to drop out at the last minute. It was the day before his birthday, and as a treat, his live-in lover Anna had arranged a surprise night at a London hotel. Tucker had no interest in cancelling it, and besides, it wasn't as if the job was so difficult that Rolfe and Tate couldn't handle it on their own. The firm needed as many people as possible to help bring back the cash. That way each person would be carrying a relatively small amount, so that if they were stopped by customs they wouldn't look too suspicious. Rolfe had asked his girlfriend Donna Jaggers, but she didn't like the sound of it and turned him down. It was not so much the trip to collect the money that she objected to, it was another, bigger job that Rolfe had started to mention that was simply getting much too serious for her liking. Craig told me that Steele had approached Tate and asked him to nick someone else's gear from them. Steele had been asked by a London gang to import 30 kilos of cocaine and was going to fly over from Holland. He told Pat he was going to be given £50,000 up front and bring the cocaine back with a member of the London gang in the passenger seat. The idea was that Tate and Tucker would rob the firm of the cocaine once it arrived over here. Steele suggested they share it between them and had told the firm he planned to land in a field near Clacton. In fact, Steele was actually going to land in a South Essex field, where Tate and the others would be waiting. A week or so earlier, Craig, Tony and Pat had obtained a machine gun from a man called Mad Mick. It had been handed over in a meeting at the Granada Motorway Services in Essex for £300. They were planning to use the gun on the man from the London firm in order to take the cocaine. I didn't know how far they were planning to go when they robbed the firm, but I knew they'd made sure that the gun worked. Rolfe and Tucker had already used the gun to spray bullets into the car of a man threatening to give evidence against Tucker in a forthcoming assault case. After putting some extra ventilation holes in the doors and windows, they knocked on the man's door. "Next time, you'll be inside it," they said, then left. By now, Jaggers was getting increasingly nervous herself, and terrified that she and Rolfe were going to be arrested at any time. She hoped that if she refused to go to Amsterdam that Rolfe might pull out. Instead, she found her boyfriend was really excited at the prospect of a night on the tiles, in a foreign country with no one to tie him down, and he looked forward to going even more. Rolfe took his Range Rover and picked up Tucker's other girlfriend, Donna Garwood, Tate's girlfriend, Liz Fletcher, and her friend, Gaynor. To make up the numbers, Tate also asked his car dealer friend, Barry Dorman, to come along, and he agreed to follow in a separate car, bringing his girlfriend Annette to keep him company. The Range Rover was the first car in the convoy to arrive in Ostend. Tate left the others in the pub while he went to the entrance of the train station where he'd agreed to meet Steele. Garwood and the others watched from a distance as Tate and Steele returned to the pub and made their way to a quiet table in the corner, where they talked for around 20 minutes. When Steele got up to go, he passed over the bulging carrier bag he'd been holding to Tate. The transaction was complete. In the meantime, Darren Nichols was standing across the road from the pub, trying to shelter from the rain and waiting for Steele to reappear. When the pair had arrived in Ostend, Steele had booked into a hotel and sent Nichols off to the ferry terminal to buy a ticket. The idea was that he would take £20,000 with him back on the overnight ferry, and that Steele would travel back to England the following morning once he'd dished out the rest of the money to the others. As always, Steele had told Nichols to make himself scarce. He didn't want anyone knowing who was on his team, just in case they tried to poach them or use his drug contacts. After 20 minutes of getting wet and watching the gang laughing and joking in the warm, dry pub, Steele eventually came out and Nichols called him over. Darren Nichols states, "It all looked really jolly from where I was, but Mick was actually really pissed off. Tate was saying it was too late for them to get the ferry back and that they'd have to stay overnight, but they wanted Mick to pay for it because they didn't have any Belgian money, and besides, he owed them for making them wait all week for their cash. I think by then, Mick just wanted the whole thing to be over with as quickly as possible. He was saying how out of control Tate seemed, how he was really hyped up about everything and behaving like a 5-year-old. It was getting quite late, and he said I might as well stay as well, as Jack would be there soon, so I used my credit card to book into the same hotel as him. About 10 minutes later, Jack arrived in his transit van, and as Mick wanted something to eat, we all wandered up the road to this Greek restaurant for a snack. Jack had been so paranoid that he'd worked up an elaborate excuse to explain why he was leaving the country. He was pretty freaked out by what had happened with customs at Felixstowe Ferry and wanted to make sure he had a cast-iron alibi just in case it all came on top. He had travelled over in his transit and he'd even put a spare wheel and brake drum in the back so he could say he was on his way to repair a vehicle. He even booked a commercial ticket which cost me around 220 quid, just so it was all legit. And there's sod's law, he didn't get stopped by customs once. Jack had 2 glasses of orange juice and then left, taking half the guilders with him. After that, Mick and I stayed in the restaurant and had a chat about what to do with the dodgy cannabis that Harris had sold to us. After the experience of being followed, Mick didn't trust the guy at all and didn't want to risk handing it over to someone in Britain just in case it turned out to be a setup. "Just get rid of them, Darren, the whole lot," he told me. "I don't care what you do, I just never want to see any of it again." It was just after that Mick first asked me if I could help him out. I don't remember anything about what I was doing, who I was with, where I was, or even the time of day. The only thing I remember was the question, "Can you get me a gun?" We'd only been back from Amsterdam a few days, and Mick was saying that any sort would do, a handgun or a shotgun, anything. I had a friend Roy, who used to have an illegal shotgun which he used for shooting rabbits, so I told Mick I'd ask him. Roy had sold his gun, but he told me he'd ask a couple of people and see what he could come up with. Over the next week, Mick called me virtually every single day to find out how I was getting on. I told him I wasn't having much luck, but he just told me to keep on trying. Now I know it sounds stupid, but I didn't bother to ask Mick what he wanted it for. I knew he had a bit of a rat problem at Meadow Cottage, and I guess I just assumed that he was going to use it for that. Then as quickly as they started, the calls just stopped, and I forgot all about it. You've been listening to Blogs 19, written by Tony Thompson. This book is available to purchase online at Amazon and other online book retailers. Many thanks for joining me for this video. Very shortly you'll be able to see some other videos from the channel, including the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos concerning this case in one convenient folder. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I look forward to seeing you all again in the next video. Take care. Cheers.